Welcome to our PowerPoint module for this week. We're going to talk about race and ethnicity in relation to health. And in order to do that, we're going to start by defining race, and then we're going to talk about the ways in which race, and particularly racism, impacts physical and mental health. I know that this is a topic that we've all been thinking more about, so I do want to leave a lot of time for discussion in class. I also want to acknowledge my own privilege in talking about this topic. I cannot draw on personal experience to understand the ways in which racism impacts health, but I can draw on empirical evidence in order to gain a better understanding of the relationship between race, racism, and health. And that's what we're going to be doing this week in class and in this module. So as I said before, we're going to focus on defining race, and then also defining racism at different levels, including systemic, institutional, and interpersonal. And then we're also going to talk, and not spend a whole lot of time on this in the module, but in our class, we're going to talk about the impacts of racism on health and how racism ultimately gets under the skin to have physiological impacts. As usual, you have your reading question that's due Monday night. You have your PowerPoint module due Tuesday night. And we don't have any additional assignments due for this week, so it's just the reading question and the module. All right, so let's start with our opening question. And this is based on the first reading and the reading that you all did, Why Genes Don't Count for Racial Differences in Health. So in the reading, Goodman, the author, recalls the following lesson from an anthropology course he took in college. Although race is still real, it is not biologically based. Rather, it is social with biological consequences. What do you think he means by this? So you can pause the module here, answer that opening question, and then return when you're done. Now, in order to discuss racial disparities in health and the connection between race and health, we first have to define race. What do we mean by race? And there are two prevailing views or perspectives on race, one of which is more historical and the other is more contemporary. The essentialist view is a more historical view of race. This has a long history in the US and around the world. The essentialist view basically argues that races are biologically defined. Race is biology, and therefore these categories are fixed. It's easy to categorize people by race, and they don't change across time and place. Meaning that the way we categorize race today is the same way we did it 100 years ago or 200 years ago, and the same way that it's done in Mexico or Brazil or Spain and so on. So this is the essentialist perspective. Now we know that there are a lot of issues with the essentialist view of race. One being that we don't see fixed racial categories. We see categories that change across time and change across place. In addition, the characteristics that we use to define or categorize people by race, like skin tone or hair texture, eye color, eye shape, these operate or exist on a continuum. Skin tone especially exists on a continuum. There is not, there aren't easily drawn lines from one race to another based on skin tone. And because of this, we can already challenge the idea of race as something that is biological and invariant across time and place. Now, beyond that, the constructionist view, which is the second view here on this slide, and this is more contemporary, argues that race is a social construct. And I'm sure you've heard this before. This is a discussion that is happening again and again across the country. And the constructionist view basically argues that social forces, such as our culture, our politics, economic forces, history, these things shape the racial categories that we come to know and the understanding of racial differences that we come to know. In addition, a constructionist view argues that categories and meanings of race are changing across time and place, and we see a lot of examples of this in the US. One example that I use in other classes is the US Census. And if we look at the way in which race has been classified and the different types of classifications that exist in the census, we see a lot of change over time. Going from 1790, our first census, to today, we've seen a lot of change. And this is one demonstration of race as a construct, as race as something that changes depending on context. Now, the views of race that we use have major implications for how we think about health and how we think about racial disparities in health. In the health sciences, race has historically been viewed as biological difference. And this has led to the assumption that racial inequalities in health must be rooted in genetic differences across racial groups. We also see a long history of scientific racism that has claimed certain races to be inferior intellectually or physically based on biological difference. One example is phrenology, or the study of skull shape, and how different skull shapes across different racial or ethnic categories determine a lot of characteristics of those people, such as criminality or intelligence. And we know that this is all a load of crap now. But historically speaking, we see a lot of examples of, in medicine and in science, of essentialist assumptions about race leading to really dangerous conclusions. So if we think or assume that racial differences in health are biologically based, that means we seek medical solutions for those biological issues. However, the more we come to know about race, the more we see that race is a social construct. And if we see race in this way, and we see racial differences in health as emerging from social conditions and environments, we must seek social solutions. Okay, and this brings us to what we're going to discuss for the remainder of the module and a lot in class. This brings us to discussing racism as a social determinant of health. Let's talk about racism and what racism is. Remember, we were just talking about race as a social construct, and the formation of these racial categories throughout history, through social context, has produced and reproduced power structures by race in our society. And we see these power structures upheld through racism. So what do we mean by racism? Racism is often assumed to be primarily an individual or interpersonal phenomenon. That is, people have internalized social bias and racist attitudes which are then enacted in interpersonal interactions. And this is important. I don't want to minimize the impact of interpersonal racism. It continues to be a significant social problem. But focusing exclusively on individual level forms of racism doesn't give us the full picture of how racism operates to perpetuate racial inequalities, including inequalities in health. So beyond individuals, racism is also institutional, meaning that racism is embedded in explicit rules and informal norms within our social institutions. Examples of social institutions include things like education, healthcare, the labor force, the criminal justice system. And we will talk about a few examples of institutional racism and racial inequalities in health. At the broadest level, we can also think of racism as systemic. You also probably heard of structural racism. Systemic racism is when institutions interactively shape racial inequalities. For example, institutional racism within the criminal justice system has led to higher incarceration among Black men in the US. And having that criminal record leads to exclusion and discrimination within the labor force. Before we go on with talking about racism, I do want to acknowledge that this diagram is rather simplistic. So in reality, different levels of racism mutually influence and reinforce one another. But the point that I want to get across is that racism goes beyond the actions of individuals. It's built into our institutions. It's built into laws and policies. It's built into norms and practices that are maybe not explicitly written into law, but nonetheless shape racial inequalities. We'll talk about how this connects to health in a moment. Let's go over a few examples of racism operating at the institutional level, and then consider how this relates to health. We see institutional racism operating in housing policies, and in housing practices. And we can think of housing as an institution, or housing is very, very interconnected with our labor force and with our economy. I mentioned this in class last week. I believe I mentioned this in both sections. But one housing policy that we have continued to see as significantly impacting the health and well-being of Black Americans is redlining. And redlining is a historical practice, though we continue to see the impacts today. It's a historical practice that was implemented in the 1930s and 40s, and in some places continued into the 60s. And this denied mortgages to certain neighborhoods. You're going to see a video on the next slide, and this is going to really delve into redlining in greater detail. In addition to redlining, historically, we saw a number of racial restrictive covenants in the US, and these are legal agreements that bar the sale of homes to non-white home buyers. This might sound very explicitly racist now, but this is a part of our recent history in the US. In addition, we also see racial steering. This is a much more subtle form of institutional racism. This is a kind of unofficial practice. And racial steering is when real estate agents guide home buyers toward or away from certain neighborhoods based on the race of that home buyer. This is technically illegal today. However, we do continue to see these practices within real estate, where certain families or people of certain race are steered toward a certain neighborhood that matches their racial composition or their race. These are several housing policies and practices that may seem really disconnected from health, but in the next slide, I'm going to ask you to draw connections between housing and redlining and the health of the Black population in the US. Here's your video question. There's a video on Inquire for you to watch called "Why Are US Cities So Segregated?" Once you watch the video, I want you to answer the following question on Inquire. How do you think the practice of redlining and persisting residential segregation has impacted the overall health of Black Americans? And I do want to note here that there are many possible responses, and there are many possible connections between redlining, residential segregation, and health. Okay, so in a paragraph, describe one or a few. At this point, you can pause the module, go to watch that video, answer this question, and then return for the rest. I'm not going to go into too much detail about interpersonal racism and health right now because we are going to discuss this in class. But I do want to point out that there's a lot of evidence to support the idea that experiences of interpersonal racism have impacts on health. And you have read at least 2 articles that provide some empirical evidence for this week. It has been argued that racism is a form of chronic stress that affects both physical and mental health. And it's chronic because racial discrimination is experienced regularly and persistently. And chronic stress, and we'll talk about this later in the semester actually, but chronic stress has been shown to cause wear and tear on the body. This really is a place where we see a mind-body connection, the experience of stress, and then how that has actual physiological impacts. This has been used, the idea of interpersonal racism or discrimination as a source of chronic stress. This has been used to potentially explain racial disparities in birth outcomes. We see huge disparities in the birth outcomes from Black mothers in terms of low birth weight or preterm birth compared to white mothers. Also, significant racial and ethnic differences in cardiovascular health, and finally, differences in lifespan and mortality. So interpersonal racism has been implicated as a determinant of these health outcomes and a determinant of the racial disparities in health that we see for these outcomes. So building on that idea of the links between interpersonal racism and health, I want you to answer the following content question. Summarize one of the 2 articles that you chose to read for this week. So remember, you got to choose 2 out of 3 possible articles. So we're not talking about the Goodman article. We're talking about those other 3 empirical articles. Choose one of those. And then I want you to summarize that article and just include the following things in your summary. What are the major research questions that the researchers are seeking to answer? What are the major findings within the paper that you chose? And finally, what is the importance of these findings? Do you think that this provides strong evidence for a link or a potential causal link between discrimination and health? So answer these 3, or put in these 3 components into your summary. And then once you have answered that content question, you can come back for the last couple of slides. Finally, here's your closing question. And I know I rapid-fired questions toward the end of this module, but you're almost done. So for your closing question, propose a policy or a general policy area that you think would narrow Black-white disparities in health. Explain why you think this policy would work. You do not need to get super specific here, but based on what you've read and based on the module, what areas do you think would be ripe for intervention? And why do you think intervening in this area would help to narrow racial disparities in health, specifically Black-white disparities? So you can pause here, answer this closing question, and then come back for the last slide. So that concludes our module for this week. As usual, we're going to have our in-class group meet on Wednesday and our Zoom group meet on Friday. And we're going to discuss the 3 empirical articles, 2 of which you have read. So please do come prepared to discuss those. I will hold class with the assumption that everyone has done the reading and is ready to talk about these studies in some detail. Okay? Please do come prepared to discuss, and I'll see you in class.